Okay, here we are again, once more, back in beautiful downtown Bridgeport at the Cathedral Parish for our RCIA class. This week is class 28. We're almost done, a couple more classes, we're almost through the year. And today we're going to be talking about two topics. One is the Sacrament of Holy Orders, or we sometimes think of it as the priesthood, but there are other parts of the Sacrament of Holy Orders, as we'll see. And the other topic that we're going to try to address a little bit anyway is religious life, or the consecrated life. That is what we usually think of as religious brothers and sisters, or monks and nuns. That's the way we usually think of them. So to begin with, remember that the Sacrament of Holy Orders, as we learned last week, was instituted by Christ at the Last Supper. And if you remember the two parts of each sacrament, the form and the matter and the form, the matter being the stuff that's used, and the form being the words that are used, the matter of the Sacrament of Holy Orders is a baptized male. Now, oftentimes people say, how come women or girls can't become priests or deacons? The reason for that is that at the Last Supper, you'll recall, Jesus and his 12 apostles, the 12 men that he chose to be his closest followers and his, you might say, his representatives after his resurrection and ascension, Jesus gave the order, if you will, to those 12 men to do this in memory of me, when he was speaking about the Last Supper, of course, what we would call the Mass. So for this reason, there have always, since the time of Christ, always only been male priests and male deacons. Perhaps there were some deaconesses at some point, but their role was very different from that of what we think of as a deacon today. Basically, they helped with the baptism of women, because women, everybody was baptized by immersion in the early church. That is, they were put in water, like in a river or something. And so, of course, they would get wet, they have to change their clothes, etc. So the men didn't help them do that, obviously. Other women would help them do that. But that doesn't really concern us. The real reason that only men can be priests, deacons, or bishops in the church today is that that's the way Jesus set things up. The 12 apostles were 12 men. He told those 12 to do this. So you can argue, some people do, that there's nothing in the Bible that says that women can't be priests, but we know that Jesus didn't ordain any women as priests, and neither did the early church. And so this is part of both Scripture and the capital T tradition, that tradition which does not change. Now, of course, we also think about marriage and the priesthood. Priests don't marry in the church today, but we know that some of the apostles were married. This is a different question. This is one of those small T traditions. So the fact that only men are priests is a capital T tradition that's been handed down by the church from the very beginning. The fact that priests don't marry is a small T tradition, a custom. And as we remember, those customs can change. So it's possible that there could be a married priesthood someday. We don't anticipate that because there's another reason. We'll talk about that in a moment. But we need to remember the difference between the male-only priesthood, which is a capital T and doesn't change, and the possibility of a married priesthood, which is a small t and could change. That's an important distinction. So, back to the matter of the sacrament, a baptized male. And Jesus instituted this sacrament, as we said, at the Last Supper, as we saw last week as well. So, there are three different grades of the Sacrament of Holy Orders. There's what we call the bishop, the priest, and the deacon. Now, these grades of holy orders are received in a particular succession. So first, a man who determines that he thinks he might want to become a priest, he submits himself to a bishop, or he speaks with a bishop's representative. Ultimately, it's the bishop who will decide whether a man will be a priest or not. It's not the man's choice, it's a bishop's choice. So when a man goes through the seminary, is accepted by a bishop for a particular diocese, he would then be first ordained to what we call the diaconate. A deacon, he would become a deacon. Now there are two different types of the diaconate. One is what we call the transitional deacon. So that is, every priest, before he becomes a priest, like me, was ordained a deacon first by a bishop. What we call a transitional or a passing through deacon. Those deacons, it's understood, are going to become priests someday, usually about a year after they're ordained a deacon in our time. The other type of the diaconate is called the permanent deacon. And these are men who are ordained for service to the church, and there's no expectation that they're going to become priests. Occasionally they do, if they go ahead and become priests, but for the most part, they are married men who want to serve the church in a particular capacity. We'll see that in a second. And they are not going to become priests, so for this reason they can be married. They don't have to be married, but they can be married, and usually are. So as I said, this permanent diaconate is about service to the church. The transitional diaconate is about the same thing, but it's only a short period of time, and usually the deacon is studying, so he doesn't have much time to serve the church. He's studying to finish his preparation for the priesthood. So the first grade, if you will, of holy orders is the diaconate, transitional and permanent. The second grade is what we call the priesthood, and we all have a pretty good idea of what a priest is. So a priest is ordained by the bishop. The bishop lays his hands on his head and says the proper words, the form, and it's part of the matter of the sacrament of the holy orders is this gesture of laying on the hands. And we see that in the New Testament in the scriptures. When the apostles chose men to be deacons and help them, they laid hands on them. We do the same thing today, part of the sacrament of holy orders. So the priest, I should say, is really distinct from the deacon. There are three things that the priest does that a deacon cannot do because he's not ordained to the priesthood. The priest can say Mass, the deacon cannot do that, confect the Eucharist, bring the Eucharist into existence. He can hear confessions and absolve sins, which the deacon cannot do. And he can administer the sacrament of anointing or the sacrament of the sick or the last rites, which the deacon cannot do because that sacrament also involves the forgiveness of sins, or the absolution of sins. So these are the three things that a priest does that a deacon cannot do. A deacon can witness marriages outside the context of Mass, or he doesn't say the Mass, obviously, no. He can preside at funerals that are not Masses. He can do baptisms, and he can preach. Those are the main things that a deacon does, besides teaching, of course, that a priest also can do, but the deacon's sacramental, if you want to say, duties are limited to those because he's not a priest. So basically witnessing marriages, presiding at funerals and wakes, baptizing children, and what was the last one I said? Preaching. Okay, so that's the priesthood. Let me just say briefly why priests make this promise of what we call celibacy, that they will not marry or have boyfriend, girlfriend, etc. The reason is that the church sees this vocation as complete self-giving in imitation of Christ, as is the married vocation, but it's done in a different way. The married couples give themselves to each other in imitation of Christ, as we saw when we studied the sacrament of matrimony. But the priest is ordained and called, if you will, his vocation is to give himself up, like Christ did, for everyone, not just to some special person or a most beloved person like a spouse and a family, but to give himself up completely for the church. And this is the primary reason that priests don't marry. The custom or the small T tradition that priests don't marry is so that they're available to give themselves completely to their people in imitation of Christ. Also because Jesus himself was not married, and so we follow that model of Jesus. Why wasn't Jesus married? He could have been if he wanted to, but he didn't. Why? Because he was giving himself up completely to all those that were looking to him for salvation and healing. Now, the third grade of the Sacrament of Holy Orders is what we call the episcopacy, or bishops. So the bishop is consecrated as a bishop by other bishops to basically lead a diocese. In our experience here in the Diocese of Bridgeport and the Cathedral Parish, we know that the bishop is in charge of or has authority over the whole Diocese of Bridgeport. And in our case, the Diocese of Bridgeport happens to be Fairfield County. In other places in the United States, for example, the state of Arkansas, the whole state, 80-something counties or more, is the whole diocese. The The cathedral is in Little Rock, in the center of the state, but it takes 7 hours to drive across, 6 or 7 hours to drive across the state of Arkansas diagonally. So the bishop is in charge of that whole state. Whereas here in our little county of Fairfield and our city of Bridgeport, our bishop is in charge of just this county, but there are also 82 parishes here. When I was living in Arkansas many years ago, there were 82 parishes in the whole state. Here, there are 82 parishes in the whole diocese, the one county. So situations are different in different parts of the world. I'm sure there are other parts of the world where the diocese is much, much larger than the state of Arkansas. But in any case, back to our point, the bishop is consecrated to lead a diocese. And so he's responsible for all kinds of things. But also, he's sort of the representative, if you will, in a way, of the Pope. He is the successor of the apostles, as the Pope is the successor of Peter, who was also an apostle. So you might think, well, what about monsignors? What about cardinals? Well, these are a little bit different things, but they're not part of the Sacrament of Holy Orders. The title Monsignor is an honorary title that's given by the Pope to priests who have accomplished some special work or some good work. Cardinals are also bishops who have been chosen by the Pope to be his special advisors, not unlike the United States President chooses his cabinet, men and women who are to advise him on his most closely trusted advisors. So the cardinals are also not always, but usually bishops, almost always bishops. And of course the Pope at the top of this hierarchy is chosen by the cardinals to be the leader of the whole church. He's already a bishop. If he weren't a bishop, he would be ordained a bishop immediately, because his first job as the Pope is to be the bishop of Rome, the Diocese of Rome, as Peter was the leader of the church in Rome as it began very early on after Peter and Paul came to Rome from the area of Palestine. So, just to refresh our memories, to review here, the 3 grades of holy orders include the deacon, both transitional and permanent, the priest, who makes 3 promises of celibacy, not to be married or have a relationship with a woman, obedience to the bishop, that is to say that when the bishop asks him to go someplace, he goes to that place and works there or does some other job if the bishop asks him. And third, the promise that we make to pray what's called the Liturgy of the Hours, or the prayer of the church, the public prayer of the church, all day, every day. 7 times a day, or 5 times a day, we fulfill this promise of praying the Psalms and some other scriptural things for the church, for the rest of the whole church. That's part of our job as priests, one of our promises. So, celibacy, obedience, and the prayer of what's called the Liturgy of the Hours, or the Divine Office. Okay, is there anything else we need to say about the priesthood? I think that pretty much covers the Sacrament of Holy Orders. Yeah. So now, let's talk a little bit about religious life. Religious life is not a sacrament. So monks and nuns, religious brothers and sisters, this is not a sacrament. But these are vows or promises that they make to a superior for the church. So, for example, let's take a nun or a religious sister. The difference between those is typically that nuns live together in a convent or a monastery and they basically stay there. Or monks live together in a monastery and they basically stay there. Religious brothers and sisters, not necessarily monks and nuns, they may be sent around to different places and sent to do different jobs and things like this. So, they make 3 promises, both these men and women. They make at least 3 promises, and those 3 promises are called the evangelical counsels, or the gospel counsels. C-O-U-N-S-E-L-S, not C-O-U-N-C-I-L-S. Counsels or recommendations: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty means not that they have nothing, although some of them choose to have nothing. Some orders or groups of religious brothers and or sisters choose to live without things. But poverty really means that they share all things in common. As in the early Christian community, the early Christians shared everything in common, and whatever they needed was given to them by the community. So groups or orders of religious brothers and sisters religious men and women, live together typically in a community, and they share everything in common. Perhaps you have 10 people living in one convent, 10 sisters, and they have 2 cars. Everybody doesn't have their own car, they share cars, things like that. Sharing everything in common. So that's poverty. Number 2, chastity. They also make promises that, like priests, they will not be married. They promise to give themselves totally to their community, and by doing that, giving themselves completely away to God and in service to the church. So that's their vow of chastity, to give themselves really to Christ by giving themselves to their community and their superior and the church. And finally, obedience. Like the priest makes a promise to be obedient to the bishop and go where he's sent and do what he's asked, so the religious brother or sister, or monk or nun, makes a vow to his or her superior, usually called a superior, sometimes called an abbot or an abbess in a monastery, which term means father and mother. They promise to do what they're asked to do. So perhaps a young woman comes into a convent or joins religious life, and she thinks that she might like to be a teacher. And her superior, the mother superior, decides, well, maybe someday, but not right now. What I'd like you to do right now is to work in the kitchen. So it's by submitting oneself to the will of the superior is analogous to submitting oneself to the will of Christ. That's the idea of religious life. In a sense, being married to Christ and to church. Okay, so let me see what else we have to say about religious life. So what do religious sisters and brothers do? Well, it all depends on their particular order or their group. Each order or group has what's called an apostolate or a charism, which is to say that some religious orders are dedicated to nursing. Some religious orders are dedicated to teaching. Other religious orders are dedicated to prayer. They don't really go out and do things. They stay in their convent or monastery, and they are called contemplative. They pray. They pray for the church, the needs of the church. They try to spend time in communion with God by means of prayer. So where do these 2 different kinds of visions of the religious life come from? What we call the active life, teachers, nurses, etc., and the contemplative life, those who are really stay inside, basically, stay in their convent and are in seclusion, sometimes called a cloister, and they pray. Where do these 2 things come from? Well, in the scriptures, if you might remember the story of Martha and Mary. Jesus comes to visit Martha and Mary and have supper with them. And while he's there, he's talking to Mary. Mary is sitting and listening to Jesus, and Martha is preparing the supper. And at some point, Martha gets frustrated and says, Lord, tell my sister to help me. I'm doing all the work here. She's just sitting there talking to you. And Jesus says to her, Martha, Martha, you are busy about many things, but Mary has chosen the better part, and it won't be taken away from her. So from this little passage, we have developed in the church over the course of 2,000 years, 2 kinds of religious life. The 2 forms of religious life, the active life, those who teach, nurse, etc., and the contemplative life, those who sit and listen to Jesus. Now, you might be tempted to say, well, gee, it seems much more useful to go out and do stuff than it is to simply sit there and pray. But remember what Jesus said. Martha, Martha, you are busy about many things, but Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her. So the contemplative life, or the praying life, is considered to be a higher grade of perfection or completion. Why? Because in heaven, thank goodness, there will be no work to do. Here in this world, there's plenty of work to do, and it's got to be done. And somebody's got to do it. But the contemplative life, or the praying life, is considered to be more perfect or more complete by the church because it's more like life in heaven, where there will be no work. Thank goodness. Now, back to the active life. So, obviously, people have to be nurses, people have to be teachers. Even in a convent or a monastery, work has to get done. The food's got to be prepared. Things have to be cleaned. Broken things have to be fixed. So it's not that one or the other of these forms or manners of religious life is more valuable than the other or better than the other. That's not the same thing as saying one is more complete or perfect. Obviously, we need both of these forms of life, religious life, the active life and the contemplative life. And different people choose to do those different things. And most of us have to do both. We have to cook our dinner, clean our house, fix broken stuff, and pray. So the church sees these two manners or forms of religious life as like two lungs of the church. It's not that we can do without one or the other. We need them both the active life and the contemplative life. But, as I said, the contemplative life is considered more perfect because it's more like life in heaven. So I think that's a pretty good foundation for both of these aspects of life in the church. The Sacrament of Holy Orders and its three grades, bishops, priests, and deacons, transitional and permanent. And the religious life. In a big picture we saw, there are all kinds of different religious lives that are lived, different manners or different, how do you say, apostolates and charisms, different things that religious brothers and sisters do all over the world. But for our purposes, what we want to understand is the difference between the active life and the contemplative life, and the fact that the church needs both of them, like two lungs. That's it for today.